Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Randy Bach, and my guest tonight is Dr. Randy Bach. I'm the president of the Newton Taxpayers Association, and that, as it might sound, is an association of Newton taxpayers. We would welcome you to join. Undoubtedly, if you live in Newton, you are a taxpayer or you're related to one. There's a chance, of course, you're paying taxes by proxy if you're renting and whatnot. But here we are in Newton, and we would like to gauge the state of the city. It's currently December 2024. And things are going on, as they always are. The news never stops. The cycles of time and life present themselves with new challenges. We are post-presidential election, and there's, the city runs its elections in the odd years, and oftentimes they are pretty odd years for us. And we're going to have apparently a new mayor coming up in this new upcoming odd year of 2025. Currently, Ruth Ann Fuller, our mayor, has declined to run again. I believe she had 2 terms, and Mark Laredo is the only declared candidate. He is a city councilor. He's been on the show, so we can reference that, and I hope to have him again on sometime relatively soon. But I would like to talk about some of the ramifications of the federal election on the city of Newton, and where Newton is right now, where it's going, and writ small and writ large, how it's going for the state of Massachusetts in comparison to, let's see, how many other states are there? 47? No, just kidding. The other 49 states. And, where do we stand? What's been Massachusetts' advantage to date? And there have been a lot of them, and whether we can maintain them. As a cautionary tale, I'd like to bring up the country of Venezuela. Why that? Well, I run a separate podcast on randybach.com, and you can go look at that, and YouTube and X and whatnot. But Randy Bach, if you spell my name right, you should be able to find it. And I've had on Professor Carlos Blanco a number of times, probably about 4 or 5 times. We talk about Venezuela and all things Venezuelan. They've obviously had their trials and tribulations with a bad governance since Hugo Chavez, I think, is beginning in the 90s. And since then, his successor upon death, his crony, basically Nicolas Maduro, who probably lost an election fairly recently, but in what could have been our worst nightmare here, the popular vote recipient did not accede to the title, and is, the president or whatever he is calls himself now, retains and remains as Nicolas Maduro. But throughout the Chavez years, Venezuela has been in swift and continuous decline. Mind you, this country is the largest oil exporter in the Americas, if I'm not mistaken, at least the largest exporter of oil in South America. And in the 1960s, much like Detroit, it was the wealthiest country in the continent of South America. And I think in the top 5, perhaps one of the top 4 or 5 wealthiest countries on earth, up there with Switzerland, United States, and so forth. And frankly, Detroit was, I think, one of the wealthiest cities on earth around that same time. What happened to those 2 places? I think those serve as cautionary tales, and we have to consider those things, because a wealthy place such as Newton, a wealthy place such as Massachusetts, doesn't necessarily stay that way. Life happens. There's a Danish proverb, amongst all the things difficult to predict, the future is the hardest. But it's not necessarily that hard, because we do have the ability of potentially learning from history. And the history writ so far is that when you muck things up, you can, what is it? There's FAFO, which I'll let you figure out the abbreviations. It's something like fool around with things and find out. If you have a system that doesn't work, Ben Stein's father was Herb Stein. He was one of the Nixonian era economic advisors. He said that which cannot continue doesn't. So if you have a shell of an operation and you're just kind of working on fumes and borrowing and whatnot, it's hard to maintain it. Things do go bankrupt. If you remember, Downtown Crossing, Filene's was there, it's not there. There are a lot of places that come and go. A lot of institutions aren't necessarily there, the next generation and whatnot. I mean, the Red Sox have been around for, 100x years, 120 years, whatever the number is, and baseball numbers are in decline. Will they jump up again? Apparently they have a little bit, but people have to adjust the product. Like baseball change things last year. They put a pitch clock up. They make you, they put a player at second base in the 10th inning so the games don't go on forever. Extra innings, it doesn't wind up 25 innings and whatnot. And so they accommodate to the audience. I think we have a question ultimately for our leaders, whether they are, leading based on their own tendencies, what they have in their history, or whether they're actually accommodating and listening to the popular sentiment that's out there. Now, I know Newton didn't go according to the way the nation did in this last presidential election. I think Donald Trump probably got the biggest landslide one could get under current circumstances. It's not Ronald Reagan's America anymore. Ronald Reagan, I believe, in '84 won Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has gone Democrat ever since, so it's not a huge shock to see it do so again. I do think there's kind of a dichotomy. This is a separate topic, and we covered it last month with Jeff Cohen here for Mass for Fair Elections. That's MA4 fairelections.org, and you can find him there and donate, hopefully, because he wants to get Massachusetts on board with a lot of other states and have us have a clean voter roll and potentially voter ID and whatnot. Donald Trump won every state that had voter ID, so you had to be an accredited voter to vote. And Kamala Harris only won states that had no voter ID. So, again, I think Trump won pretty overwhelmingly for the situation at hand, which is that there's only certain states that are probably out of reach because of kind of bloat in their voter rolls. So that's a separate issue. But the point, though, is that are we kind of going to hunker down as a state and kind of double down on more Healy, or are we going to accommodate? And this is an issue in local government, because my understanding is the city council is going to rethink the sanctuary city status. This was enacted in 2017, and what is a sanctuary city? Well, I think probably people mostly have a good idea what that is. It's one that's accommodating to illegal aliens, quote unquote, undocumented individuals. If I leave my wallet at home, I'm undocumented, but I'm not illegal. And the question here is why? And I understand it makes people feel good, and they a little bit of virtue signaling, and maybe it's genuine virtue to do this. I'm going to leave that out of the topic of this discussion. But what a sanctuary city does is it impedes the handing out of actual justice such as accorded by our nation's laws. If you don't like a particular law, you can work to change it. But to ignore it and to impede it and to create obstacles for it is contrary to the dictates of the people who passed the law to begin with, and in the sense, the continuity of those who have allowed it to be there. So if you didn't want, like the marijuana laws, what did people do? They referendumed, if that's a verb, and they politicked for it, and they got them changed. Okay, well and good. I personally was not in favor of that, but that's what it is. If you want to change the laws of the nation, you have a chance to vote for it. But we did, in this case, vote for it, and what people voted for is they want more stringent documentation, application, and people for it to be here as part of our general corporation, our political body. Incorporation means the embodiment, to be part of to be citizens, have investment here, and not have people who come in without invitation or without acknowledgement and so forth. I mean, we have, I think, probably the best country on earth, and there are lots of people all over the country, all over the world, who would like to be American citizens. And it's a matter like at the bakery, you take a number and you wait your turn. And I don't think it's that difficult a concept. And so letting people kind of cut the line is never a good, kind of never a good look at that bakery. Somebody walks in, takes your spot. There's some Sopranos episode where he winds up shooting the clerk. I think Tony Soprano's nephew, because somebody cut in line. So nobody really likes that. And I don't think even the legal, Mexican Americans and so forth who have been here, they appreciate that as well, because Texas, frankly, voted for Donald Trump. So what's the point of all this? I think I would like to, have people here kind of consider what it means to be a sanctuary city, which is to ignore, state and federal statute about being able to be here. If you want to come in through the airport, you have to show all kinds of documentation. Somehow, if you slip through a border, a land border, you don't. I don't think that provides safety. There have been numerous cases of increased crime and odd, unusual crimes, kind of rapish kind of crimes in Nantucket, if I'm not mistaken, on juveniles. It's not to say every illegal alien is a criminal, but there's no reason to have any extra criminals, and mind you, to pay people to be here. This is something that comes out of state coffers when you wind up paying people, housing and cards and phone cards and all this kind of stuff to be here. It's not something that's afforded. If it's a benefit that comes from your tax dollars, it theoretically should go back to those people who are paying the tax dollars in terms of services or in terms of refund. Massachusetts is not really that good at refunding tax money. Getting back to the Venezuela example, Venezuela wound up, it wound up being something that is not going to continue, therefore it doesn't continue. They have a plethora of oil. They've got oil up the wazoo, but they are not having a fruitful economy because it's more than that. You have to actually be able to grow an economy beyond just oil and selling oil. And if the oil does get sold, does it only go to your cronies and whatnot? So you need kind of the places that have prospered in the Western world are those with a free interchange of ideas, respect for rule of law and commerce. And when you kind of pile on regulations or have things go to your cronies, things tend to devolve. There are a lot of other reasons as well, but living outside your means is one of them. And that's what Venezuela's been doing. So they borrow money even though they have oil and whatnot, and they wind up giving the jobs out to their cronies and so forth. I don't want to get too far into Venezuela, except to point out that these competitive advantages of being the wealthiest place on earth 60 years ago doesn't necessarily translate to continued wealth unless you're working at it. The United States advantage has been competitiveness and basically being able to bubble up kind of the entrepreneurial spirit. And the question is, do we do that here in Massachusetts and do we do that in Newton? There's two basic types of running economies. There's one that kind of works from filtering kind of grassroots and have people, rub up their ideas and then get funding for it and grow organically. And most of our big companies now, Amazon, Tesla, Dell, Microsoft, all this kind of thing, those came from ideas that got nurtured. They weren't rich people to begin with that made those things. And I suppose Bill Gates was a little bit wealthy, but you understand that he became magnificently much more wealthy once his idea took off. And all these ideas wind up making money if they're able to benefit people by the virtue of people wanting their product and using it. Then there's the converse, which is kind of the top-down economy, the command economy. And that's more the Soviet concept, where you come up with a stipulation of what you expect things to happen, you order people to do it. I bring this up because I think that some of the housing dictates are more in the latter than the former. There's no reason to think. My older son is an economics major, and we've both been to Tokyo, although not together. Tokyo has no zoning. This is an amazing thing for people who go visit there, because it's a thriving city, and it's intricate. There's rail lines. Everything works really fabulously. It's incredibly efficient. There's no graffiti. Everything's on time. People are polite, pleasant, and the place is like super crowded. You go on an intersection in Shibuya district, and it's like, I've heard it's even more crowded in China, in Hong Kong and so forth, Shanghai. But from what I've seen, it's like, easily 8 or 10 times as crowded as Times Square, New York City, and probably 20 times more crowded than any intersection I've ever been in Boston. And yet people are civil. They're moving around, and there's no jostling, there's no kind of homeless, there's no kind of people panhandling or bothering you. There's no aggression. There's like it's a kind of a crime-free place. And how do they do that? Well, they don't have massive in-migration. They don't have a continual flux of multi-languages, people not understanding each other. They have social buy-in for what the place is. And I think there's kind of a pact for what that represents. Everyone understands that diversity is our strength, diversity is our strength. But frankly, diversity can come, but secondarily to shared interest in common goals and civility. And the purpose of the border is to have that ability to determine those people that come in, if you need people to come in, so forth, and tasks, and you're growing and maybe your own population not fulfilling the number of people you have to. We can talk about that separately, but basically you need that gradation in order for people to decide who their next new neighbors should be, and whether they want to figure that out on their own, and whether they should have the power to do so. And apparently, this last election said we do, and we should. And so I'm going to come to the second point here, maybe belatedly, but what is going on with our own migration? People are coming to the United States writ large, and we have sanctuary cities in Newton and other places in the Commonwealth and so forth, and Massachusetts is going to be a sanctuary state, according to Maura Healey. She's going to resist and whatnot. But I have a chart here, which I want to show. Maybe we can flip the cameras around a little bit. And this is a map of the United States according to in-migration, out-migration. So there's migration to the United States. Maybe there we go, from other countries. But within the United States, there are people coming and going. The parts you can't really see are the parts where people are leaving. So we don't have maybe the color scale great, but the biggest loser right now is this part you can't see over here on the West Coast, California. Up here you can't see. New York State is pretty much second. We are a little bit better than New York State, but not much. We're on the scale of Illinois, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and for some reason Louisiana. But what all these states, except for Louisiana, have in common is they are Democrat states. The states that are losing people are on the left, and those are states that tax higher and regulate more. And people are moving to the Southeast. These are all Republican states, and Texas they're moving to. And part of it's maybe weather, a little bit better weather. But the point here is that when you have, I'm going to close this, but the point is when you have these kind of in-migration, out-migration things, it does change some of the calculus you have to do preparatory to running a city government and a state government. So we're going to focus more on the city government. And how does this play out? Well, we have this kind of rule, again, a top-down command structure rule that we have to have dense, housing. We have to kind of like take away all the control within Newton on the size and the type of housing, the integrity, the look of neighborhoods to allow, kind of units to sprout up at any of the train stops, except for a couple for some reason, which were accepted. We'll leave that aside. And one at Chestnut Hill, and there's another one, I can't remember, Elliott, I think. For some reason, those were accepted. I don't know what was special about those neighborhoods. They're on the same green line, but if you're Chestnut Hill, you didn't get that. But other places did. Waubun, they're going to have a big unit there. And I assume Newton Center and whatnot. They're going to have big units. Now, the question is, if people are leaving the state of Massachusetts, why do you need all this housing all of a sudden? I mean, are you just making a new kind of bubble of units? I mean, we saw during COVID that all of a sudden people, etherealized. They didn't have to be in any given place at work. They were working from home and on computers and whatnot. They didn't have to be any place. And so office market went down. The number of downtown retail was kind of overbuilt essentially. We have the same possibility of happening here, and it's going to be an ugly thing if everyone kind of leverages out for these big housing units that wind up empty. And what's not going to happen is they're never going to really be truly empty because Newton's a desirable place. They're going to be quasi-empty, and maybe the prices go down. Maybe you're going to get people who are not really going to be necessarily adding to the economy of Newton. Who knows? I don't want to comment on this too much. People can kind of put their money, invest where they will. But I think it's a reasonable question to ask, why we need, all these kind of, housing dictates from the state to the city. I think Newton has been able to do this on its own reasonably well. I'm not in favor of all the new housing that's happened. I think that we, in a sense, as a city, should have kind of a covenant about the things that we approve here because we are all in this together. We pay, city taxes, and we should have some. If we have residential zoning for certain areas, those shouldn't be changed except by plebiscite vote. But that has happened. We've had the Trio building come in. I kind of like it. I go to some of the restaurants underneath. It's not the worst thing in the world. I get it. I think some growth is fine if the population mandates it. But most of the growth has been not because population is there, but because there's more kind of square footage per person. At the same time, we just don't seem to understand Massachusetts. I think we've been favored and blessed by having had a really good run to date. Massachusetts has, along, I think, with New York, has one of the highest, education levels of any state. And we get, I think, 1 or 2 in the amount of funding for research institutions. So our kind of number 1 and 2 industries in Massachusetts are education, Harvard, MIT, all the various colleges and whatnot. And I think number 2 is kind of research-based funding. Now that can change. That can change, with an election. There are going to be different leaders of NIH and CDC and HHS and whatnot. And I think there's going to be a different pattern of funding granting. Our institutions, I think, have been a grave disappointment. We've seen, a lot of kind of odd politics going on at the Harvard campus and elsewhere. And I'm not sure those things are going to necessarily fly. My point is, when you go to Vegas or casino or whatever, you put your money down, you spin the wheel, and you win or you lose. I think Massachusetts, in a sense, is putting their bets down on a certain way and a certain, kind of idea of what's going to happen. I think partially already they have lost. And then the question becomes, if people are leaving the state, who's coming in? If you just want to be a sanctuary state, you're not going to maintain that level of high education if you're taking in, people who don't, necessarily read and write in English, and kind of ipso facto, by the virtue of their out-migration from other places, they're not necessarily doing that well in those other places either. Not to say they can't. I think most all of us have had, people emigrate from other countries who didn't have money, and over generations, I'm here. 3 of my 4 grandparents came from other places. So it does happen over time. But if there's a short play and a long play, that's a long play. The question is, can you kind of deal with it in the shorter term, or are you going to have Massachusetts turn into some version that of itself that you might not want to see? The engines for our maintenance of growth may be challenged by virtue of different funding from the federal government and by virtue of population flux. The only real segment of our population in Massachusetts that's growing right now is, I think, the 65 and above. Now, I am 65 and above. And I'm happy to be, because it beats the alternative. But I don't look around and see my cohort as that which is going to lead Massachusetts to the next generation. So I think we have to be thinking about attracting the people that those other states, Florida and whatnot, are attracting. And is that going to happen because we have great weather? I don't think so. Florida has its own benefits and so forth. I mean, obviously they get hurricanes and whatnot. Texas, ditto, has reasonably good weather. Maybe it's too hot. But we're not doing it based on those items. We have to be a better place because people can have commerce here. And the actual wealth of nations, Adam Smith, the wealth of nations happens through open trade, physical items, and trade of intellectual ideas. And we have to be opening and considering those things. But as it stands now, people are finding, even with Massachusetts with its high income and high level of education and reasonable infrastructure, and I, despite my dissatisfactions with the way Newton schools have done comparatively to other similar schools and school systems locally of similar suburbs, ours is apparently better than most every other state. Nonetheless, we are losing people. What's up with that? Well, part of the COVID experiment is that people stayed and worked from home, and they wind up not having quite the same ties to locality. I know somebody who's young, and he's working in New York City, but he's not in New York City. He doesn't have to be there but once every month or two. So people are going to wind up kind of voting with their feet and voting with their abilities to perhaps work in certain industries which might physically be in a place, have a headquarters in New York City or something like that, but they can be sitting in upstate New York or sitting in the middle of Pennsylvania or whatever, doing it. And so we have to kind of get in a more competitive footing, in my view, as a city, and I don't think necessarily through being a sanctuary state. I think we have to be a sanctuary, if anything, to nurturing our own people, helping them thrive, helping them become wealthy, reducing some of the regulations and so forth, and having a state that kind of gets on the same plane and panel as North Carolina, South Carolina, and whatnot, which are gaining people like crazy. And they have their own issues, obviously, recent flooding and whatnot. Every place has its stuff. but you have to ask, why are people going somewhere else? You know, we have the same thing happen with Newton schools. We had a 14% reduction in Newton schools from, I think, 2019 to present. And we've had no reduction in the number of teachers, basically, and we've had no reduction in the number of schools. So, you know, what's up with that? We're a Newton Taxpayers Association. We're going to be looking out for you in this regard. But if you don't climb on board and try to you know, activate and clamor for some of the things we're talking about here, then, you know, I don't think it's going to turn to Venezuela or Detroit, but it's not going to be, you know, leading the nation in income. It's not going to be leading the nation in education. All these kind of things that are really rather ephemeral. You know, they can disappear over time. You know, you know, a lot of the institutions that we have, they have good minds and so forth, but they have to kind of adapt, you know, somewhat and accommodate a different sensibility about what people want, given, again, just the migration aspects. I covered a fair amount of my questions. I wrote some Q&A for myself. Let's see if I missed any. I think we kind of covered most of the things. You know, I suppose I have a question here. What lessons can Newton take from the state's declining labor force? You know, the labor force here, well, I'm not going to leave that stuff aside because it's too pedantic. And, you know, I think what we're going to have to really think about is, if we become a sanctuary state, are we also a growing state? If we're not a growing state, I don't think you necessarily need to have kind of people flowing in. If you just want to do it to feel good, well, fine. But you're going to do it at some cost to yourself and your neighborhoods and whatnot. And those are the things that we have to ponder and consider as we go forward in Newton. So, questions from the audience. Well, I only have about 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to say this about that. You know, I've enjoyed living in Newton. We've been here since 1999, and for the most part, it's been, you know, as advertised, a garden city. And I think people have to kind of adopt that ethos of what it is that Newton represents. You know, we don't have Tokyo. We don't have Tokyo's absence of zoning regulations. I think we've managed to grow somewhat and been reasonably successful and maintain ourselves as a reasonable kind of outlet for people who live in Boston, excuse me, work in Boston and want someplace to have a family and whatnot. But I think we lose the message of what our attractiveness is if we take away from the sense of being the garden city. And we just turn into like another urban place. I think you're going to lose some of it. I think we've already lost a little bit on the education part. When I was a kid, my cousins lived in Newton, so I came up here from New York City with my folks quite a bit. And Newton had the #1 schools in the country. I think maybe #1, #2, and the #1 or 2 safest city in the country. I don't think either of those things pertain currently, and then you'll have to decide which Newton it is you want to have, which one you want to maintain. So please follow us on Facebook at the Newton Taxpayer Association, easy to spell. Try to contact us through there. You can find me. I'm on social media, as I mentioned. I'm on randybach.com, so you can contact me if you have any questions about this episode or want to suggest items for next. So thank you so very much. Thank you so very much for being on, and maybe we can get Mark Laredo and any other candidates who are running for mayor to come on and discuss some of these issues.